joining us. Today I'm interviewing Kamran Shamsabad. He's a 25-year-old lawyer from Western Sydney who is running for the seat of McMahon in the upcoming Australian federal election. Although always having an interest in politics, he has never been politically active or joined any political party previously. However, it was with the recent authoritarian responses by the government to the recent pandemic, which saw people crushed by certain policies such as lockdowns, restrictions, and coercion, that had motivated him to join the Australian Liberal Democrats. So, Cameron, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's good to be joining you. And I'm glad, obviously, given you've been talking about this project for so long, that it's finally off the ground, and I'm happy to be a guest on it.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, well, just to start off, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and your political leanings and what led you to join the LDP.
Sure. Well, I guess the easy way to put it is my background is I am a Western Sydney boy. I was born and raised in Western Sydney. I'm still living in Western Sydney at the moment. Came from a very working class background. My mum and dad both sort of did it tough getting started. My dad's a migrant from Iran who came to Australia with $10 in his pocket, and my mother, her family are all sort of working class background as well. My grandfather, my mother's father, was a metal worker, and my mother, obviously, her sisters, they went on and they found similar lines of work. Obviously, my mother was a childcare worker, still is, but also worked in various sort of retail sort of jobs. And my aunt is a hairdresser, so very working class background. And then I made the leap as the sort of second person in my family to go to university, first one to go and become a lawyer. So I decided I would go to law school, become a solicitor, and then potentially a barrister later on, once I've got a few more grey hairs. And the idea is essentially I wanted to fight for justice, and I also wanted to start breaking down some of those barriers which exist. And effectively, although I'm at the very start of my career, as you mentioned, I took a dive not only politically recently, but also at the very start of my career. I was working in the beginning of 2020 as a tip staff to a judge. And after I left that job, working in the courts, I subsequently was put in a position where I had to get a graduate job. The market blew up, obviously, in 2020. No one had jobs for graduates. It didn't really matter what profession you were in. And then, I started witnessing not only was there this great economic decline, but, we had people being brutalized and people being attacked and coerced left, right, and center. And it progressively got worse throughout the pandemic. And I remember I'd spoken to a friend, or a few friends actually, who were asking me about the constitutionality of all of these things and the legality of all of these measures. And I made a very clear point that if the opportunity was given to me, as a junior solicitor, I would fight for freedom and I would stand up to the government on these people's behalf. And sure enough, at the beginning of 2021, that's what happened. I was given the opportunity by a small law firm to get involved with Rebel News's Fight the Fines campaign. And I jumped, headfirst into that. So I've been fighting for, over the past year, the rights of particularly people that have been given COVID fines, but also a smattering of other people, such as people that have gotten excessive quarantine bills or people that have been stuck in administrative detention. And it's not just in New South Wales where I'm based, it's also been around Australia. So I've had clients in WA, the Northern Territory, South Australia, none in Tasmania. That's the only one I think I've missed. But basically all around Australia, I've helped people. I joined the LDP, as you mentioned, last year. I was not planning to become political. I'm not really a big fan of the way politics is done. I was planning on obviously pursuing my legal career alone. But during this process and this awakening that things are getting progressively worse, particularly in 2021, decided that I had to make my voice heard politically as well and lend my hand to the party that was standing for freedom. So I decided the LDP is the right one for me. It's a libertarian party. It's a party that's been against lockdowns and COVID coercion from the beginning. And on that basis, I said, okay, well, these guys might have room for someone like me. And just so happened that they invited me to stand at the next federal election in the seat of McMahon and run against Chris Bowen of the Labor Party, who's the incumbent in that seat. And I told them, obviously, I would do that very happily, and I would do my best to pursue the cause of freedom in Western Sydney as well for the party. So that's really where we're at the moment. The other anecdotal stuff is, I'm married. I'm nominally a Zoroastrian, and as I said, my father's a migrant from Iran, so I'm half Persian. I have a 3-legged dog. So lots of little tidbits there that you can probably guess make me a little bit more unique than your average candidate.
Uh-huh. What's the dog's name?
Dog's name is Pluto.
Pluto. What type of it?
3-legged Jack Russell.
Jack Russell. Oh,
Yep.
unique.
Yep.
Okay, well, having said that, what is your assessment of the political and social landscape of Australia at the moment?
It's an interesting sort of time now for us because, at the moment, I feel like we have a much larger proportion of people who are not necessarily just interested in voting for greater freedom and for representatives that are pushing those interests, but also a greater proportion of people that are disillusioned with the two major parties, as well as the alternative on the left, which is the Greens. All of those parties presided over essentially one of the worst economic and social catastrophes in Australian history during the last 2 years, and very callously put the human rights of everyday Australians into the rubbish for that period of time in order to pursue their policy agenda. And there's going to be, I think, a large backlash to that at the polls. But with that said, I think that the long-term effects are going to be not necessarily, that UAP or the Liberal Democrats will win the next election or something crazy like that, but more so you're going to start to see as these parties gain more and more traction at the next election and the following state election, there will be a greater shift away from the major parties in the minds of everyday Australians. And Australians will start to hopefully accept, and I think they will start to accept, that these minor parties should not be viewed as just minor parties, that they should be viewed as serious alternatives. Now, I've been very strong in making clear, in order for the people to actually accept that the Liberal Democrats or UAP or something like that are serious alternatives, and I'm not just saying them, it could be the Reason Party, it could be the New Liberals, one of those smaller parties that's getting more traction. In order for that to be accepted by the public as an alternative, these parties need to take themselves serious as well, which means that we have to be very clear on our message and our principles. We need to be very, very consistent with our candidates. And most of all, we need to move away from, or stay away from, in some cases, political ideas and political positions which would start to move us into the waters of more crazy sort of thinking. We want to be accepted as mainstream parties. So you're not appealing to fringe groups. You're appealing to essentially the body politic of Australia, the main sort of body of citizens, everyday people, with your policies. And I think if that happens, there's going to be at least one or two parties on the centre to centre right, as the media would describe it, who will gain more traction. And I think you'll find that they probably fit into the space on the right that the Greens would occupy on the left. And I'm not sure at the moment whether that's going to be the LDP, though I hope it. It could very well be that something like UAP takes that position. It could very well be the case that the New Liberals or the Reason Party takes a similar position somewhere around the centre. But I'm very much of the view that the landscape at the moment is in transition. You're going to start to see more fracturing of the major parties, more splintering of the major parties. And you'll see very, very strong personalities, such as John Ruddick from the Liberals has now moved over to the Liberal Democrats, and he's a leading figure in our party. And you'll start to see more of those prominent Liberals or prominent Labor figures going where their views are better represented and taking a whole bunch of the base with them.
Mm-hmm. I would say that this is more of a it's more of an example of what's happening in Australia than what's been happening overseas as well. We've seen that with in Britain with the UKIP Reform UK Brexit Party, and along with the Eurosceptics and the Tories and the Labour that came over to them, and also in the US with the whole Trump movement that also gained a lot of working class, traditionally democratic voters too. So I would say there is definitely a shift at the moment happening right across the world where traditional voting voters are now open to finally jump to other parties, which were at one stage they would never consider doing before. It would seem that Australia is not immune to that also.
Yeah, well, I would agree. I think this has been a Western sort of transition. In particular, I would say it's Western. You can see it a lot in Western countries that there has been that transition democratically, and I think it's just starting to catch up in Australia. The Liberal Democrats have been around for 20 years, and there has been members elected to Parliament, whether it's in WA or in Victoria, or we had David Leyonhjelm in the Senate, and it has happened. But there's never been this level of attention to the minor alternatives before, because I think the Australian public was still wrapped in that mindset, and it's taken time for not only the political landscape, as you mentioned, to shift, but also for those sort of cultural milestones that occurred overseas to have their impact and make their wave in Australia. And I think we will start to see more of that wave crashing in Australia and sweeping away some of the older, more rotten elements of the way the political system did function. So you'll start to see the Liberal Party, I think they're the first cab off the rank in relation to splitting. I'm not sure if you're aware of they're essentially already fighting it out in the New South Wales Supreme Court. They're duking it out over the question of whether or not the Prime Minister can just parachute in his captain call candidates. And that's, something which the base is rejecting, because the idea that the Prime Minister from the top down can just assign who the candidate is, or that some small body of the leadership can assign, the candidates for every electorate, without even consulting the base, is just a ridiculous idea. And the idea that that party could then govern the country, despite it being obviously not representative in who makes up that party's leadership, is in itself a massive, massive problem for, the base. And if you're a conservative and you're in a party like that where you're being marginalized because the top-down leadership is more to the left, the first thing you're going to be looking at is, well, how much longer am I going to keep eating this before I can actually go and do something about it? I think when Corey Bernardi took his little leave from the Liberal Party, he probably didn't carve out what he was expecting and what he was hoping for, but he did show that there is a large number of Conservatives who are happy to pack it up and go somewhere else. And in the post-COVID, I'm hoping I can say that, in the post-COVID period where there has been this dramatic shift, not just in conservative sort of leadership, but a dramatic shift in leadership generally in the Western world, but Australia very prominently. We had both major parties during this period basically enact the same policies, which were draconian and authoritarian in their basis. And whenever you get those, policies with the same contemptuous outcomes and the same contempt for human rights across the board, regardless of whether it's Labor or Liberal. You know, what would once have been seen as a beautiful piece of bipartisan sort of politics has shown that when it's expressed in this manner, it's nothing but perverse. And people have seen the shift. Conservatives in particular in the Liberal Party that I've spoken to have said it's not the kind of thing that they were ever expecting to have to deal with from the Liberal Party. And, you know, you'll get them maybe saying that the first lockdown they could understand, first maybe 3 to 6 months of the pandemic to get your bearings. But then the persistent things that happened in particular at the end of last year, you know, whether it's in New South Wales or South Australia, you know, it wouldn't really matter. You're seeing that the Conservatives said, ultimately, we're just inflicting too many wounds to the country for no benefit. And that, you know, that is going to play out down the track when all of these people go to the polling booths, or they're required to actually decide where they want to put their chips. They're not going to be interested in putting it into the party where, you know, 50% of the members base, 50% of the leadership at the very minimum is in favor of basically authoritarian socialist, you know, dogma ruling the country.
Do you think, push come to shove though, those Liberal Party members who are against the lockdowns and all the other measures, would they actually cross the floor and join the Liberal Democrats? Because there are plenty of examples right across the Western world, particularly, where you would find, in theory, a politician would have more in common with a minor party than one of the two major ones, but yet elect to still stay despite everything. For example, in Britain, you could have a Eurosceptic Tory, but as much as they may be a ally to the cause, they would never cross the floor and join Reform UK or UKIP before that. Do you think that's going to be the case with the Australian politicians too?
I think you'll start to see it more in the UK and places like that as well. Once the alternatives start to be looked at as more viable alternatives in terms of elections and in terms of resources and in terms of media attention, because let's face it, the minor parties, unless there's a negative story to run about a minor party, generally speaking, the media will not run stories about minor parties because they like to preserve that very tight status quo, which allows them to essentially box up very neatly the political landscape. They don't like the complexity of having too many minor parties in there. If in the UK you start to see more people generally from the base trending towards those minor parties, I think you'll start to see more high-profile leadership starting to make the transition as well. I think that the problem most leaders that have been entrenched in the political system have is they've got obviously vested interests in their position. And for a lot of them who are not obviously putting principle first, they're putting politics first. The last thing they want to do is be outside the room where it happens. They want to be in that room. And if that means that they've got to continue under the same flag while under protest, obviously, they would prefer to keep their colors for the time being so that they can be in there. But if they are given the opportunity and they are given the certainty that this is going to be a viable movement from small to medium or large size parties, the reality is you'll probably see a lot of them trying to catch that new wave because they will believe at that stage, and this is, you know, the leaders are always the last ones to sort of come around. They'll start to catch that wave because they will know that that's going to eventually lead them back to being re-elected. So they can be closer to their principles and they can be re-elected on their principles. And I think, you know, in order to get that shift and in order to have the leadership come on board, we need to start seeing more of a groundswell of sort of public support for these minor parties. So if you start to see at the next election, you know, even though they may not win, minor parties get a lot more first preferences. you'll start to see that a lot of those political leadership will start to move with their base accordingly. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be this election. I think that there's definitely ways and there's places that need to be caught up on. I think the political system is still reacting to the last 2 years. And this, Russia-Ukraine thing certainly has the potential to shake things up even further. But one thing's for certain, in the next decade, this is going to have fallout repercussions. There will be economic fallout from the 2 years and all the public debt. There will be political fallout because now we have a much more authoritarian sort of political system. You're going to see much more resort to coercion and to force, and much more involvement in the private lives of individuals over the next decade. And on top of that, you'll start to see more of a backlash to mainstream media that's been promoting the current status quo. And that's already begun. And you can see that with, companies like Rebel News or some of the more online journalists, the independent guys like Real Rukshan. They're polling and they're getting better numbers than most mainstream outlets. And you can start to see that's where the shift begins. If the model is transferred from just taking live stream videos to providing some content as well, and providing something that's accessible to people, you'll start to see people tuning in there as well, more than the mainstream media. And in my view, that's the way the thing starts to shift much more, is once we all start expressing our ideas in a new way on a new platform and away from the very, very controlled narrative that the mainstream would sort of provide.
In keeping with the public, as much there does seem to be a groundswell and the public seems to be never before as angry or as willing to be objective with their vote as ever before. However, there is also the other side of the coin, where there seems to be plenty of people of the Australian everyday public that seems to be not only okay with the lockdowns and the restrictions, but demand it, if not even more. There were plenty of people condemning the protests. So as much as there could be a big groundswell and the protests and the marches are huge, do you run the danger in thinking that's more majority than what it is?
I think you're correct, and you've diagnosed it right. I wouldn't say that it's majority of people are annoyed enough about the situation to actually go out there and vote minor party first. I think the numbers from last I saw were somewhere around 30% of Australians are contemplating voting for a minor party first, or voting for something other than the Liberal, Labor or Greens sort of persuasions. What I'd say is that I completely can comprehend that there is still a large number of people out there who, if they're not still supportive of lockdowns for the current time, they are at the very least supportive of the idea that they were justified in the past. And, you can see that particularly in the more elite quarters of the society. They think that the lockdowns and the restrictions were absolutely necessary for public health and safety. And I don't want to typecast people too much, but just saying generally, I have a great number of friends who are obviously not from the Western suburbs, but they are in the legal profession, and they would be what ordinary people would say are elites. And at the end of the day, whether they're judges or they're high profile lawyers, they believe genuinely that the restrictions were necessary and that they're proper, and that the current winding back of restrictions is even sometimes premature or negligent on behalf of the New South Wales government. But that sentiment is shared in large quarters of the society. There's still a huge number of people that believe that some restrictions are necessary. There's a ever decreasing number that believe lockdowns are a good idea. or that mandates are a good idea. But at the end of the day, it is sizable, like you said, still. And the reality of the situation is that's going to continue to be the case. There will always be a quarter of people that are going to think that this govern by strength approach and deal with the repercussions later is the right thing. Some of them, and you can see this particularly with the left side of politics, who previously had championed anti-authoritarian causes, but now are very pro-authoritarian. Some of these guys, they're actually on the perspective that the lockdowns were not hard enough. And, as crazy as that is to someone like me, that is certainly a sentiment that exists. I think what I have been worried about, and I've been worried about this throughout the entire pandemic, I've written articles on it, in fact. I've been worried about the fact that we're no longer having a debate between left and right as to whether or not taxes should be X or Y. We're not having a debate as to whether or not we should put an excise on this or that. We're not having even a debate about whether or not children should be taught, Invasion Day or Australia Day in school. These sorts of cultural and economic debates have all been put aside. What we are essentially having a debate now about in Australia, and this is why it's been very tough. It's been a tough period because we're having a debate about whether or not someone's basic human rights applies in the way that they've always applied, or whether they no longer apply in that manner. The debate has been, do I have a right to leave my home? It hasn't been a debate about whether or not I have the right to, go and buy petrol for a particular price without a particular tax, for example, or whether I can buy a luxury car without a particular tax. It's a question now about, do I have the right to see my family today, or has the government told me no? And in the absence of any criminal activity, we're talking about just a general restriction. Can they just generally restrict you without having actually broken the law, without you being a criminal, who's murdered someone or stolen something? You're just at home. There's a good portion of people out there who say, in line with the government, you shouldn't be able to leave home today because you could make someone sick. And not because you do have a virus, but you could have a virus. So we're now having a dialogue, not just in Australia, but in the Western world. We're having a very, very fundamental dialogue as to what the nature of our human rights are. Do we have the human right? Do we have the natural rights to leave home and go and see our family? Do I have a right as a son to mourn my father at his funeral, or to throw him a funeral, if obviously the state says otherwise? What are my rights as a father myself if I want to go to a hospital and see my child be born and support my wife? Many hospitals were kicking people out. In terms of returning to my country, we had this happen to thousands of Indian Australians. They were told they're not allowed to enter their own country, and returning to their country would be treated as a criminal act. They would be criminalized and fined for returning to their own country. More fundamentally, and this is what my court cases have been about, we have had a large number of people, particularly in the last year, become in opposition to these draconian and authoritarian measures. Is the government able to suppress opposition of, restrictions and of rules which violate the fundamental human rights of every citizen in this country? And the answer to that has been no. The government's position stated in the court cases, and the government's position stated generally in the media, has been no, you don't have a right, if there's a pandemic, to go and protest us, or if there's an emergency to go and protest us. And the scary part is that there's a very large segment still of people in our society who say, now that the genie's out of the bottle, yes, the government's right. You don't have any human rights to go and protest. You don't have any special category to which you can apply yourself as able to, go out there and oppose whatever's happening. That very fundamental debate that is happening right now on every level of our society is one which is extremely important, and at the same time extremely scary. Because if we don't come out on the right side of that debate, and I mean that in the historical sense, if we go in the direction that we're heading at the moment, and if the other side wins, which is your right to protest us is conditional on us giving you leave to protest us, we will, within this century, move into waters whereby the country is no longer recognizable in the sense that it once was. Because being from an Iranian background, I can say a country where the only protests that occur are the ones that the government has sanctioned at the times the government has sanctioned it, means that the only other gatherings that occur are illegal gatherings, and they'll be treated as illegal gatherings and treated as illegal opposition. So, in the pursuit of avoiding that terrible consequence, we have to be very, very careful in how we proceed, and we have to be very careful in how we market ourselves to the general public, because we have to make sure this debate is won by the libertarian and the pro-freedom side.
I would say my analysis of the situation is the old, as you mentioned, the old paradigm of left versus right is now obsolete.
Yeah.
The new paradigm, I would say, is either authoritarianism versus freedom.
Yeah.
Which, with both on both sides of the equation, transcends the left and right. But having said that, as for an explanation as to how we could sleepwalk into a tyranny, a lot of people have this, I don't know, this belief of, oh, can't happen here. It would never happen here. It happened in China, happened in Europe, but it just won't happen here. And combine that with the lack of, I suppose, history of knowledge of how these things work. I have a background in international relations and history, so I can see the writing on the wall. I can see the patterns. It's not exactly the same. After all, this is Australia, not Germany. It's 2021, 2022, not 1930. So obviously it's not exact, but there are certain formulas at play. You just tweak it just enough, it all kind of runs the same course. I mean, look at during the protest, how many people I saw online openly condemning the fellow countrymen, who openly was saying, if you're pro these protests, defriend me from Facebook. I don't want to know you. Essentially saying I wanted to only live in an echo chamber. And not only that, they seem to be also basically pro-authority. I had a newsman that I volunteered at one stage at a news station, and he was my old boss. He was like frothing at the mouth over the internet, just saying, if you see anyone in the crowd, report them to Crime Stoppers. If you see any employers, if you see any of your employees in the crowd, fire them. It was just this, like I said, frothing at the mouth, pro-authoritarian mentality happening here. And I think a lot of Australians, they seem to have this disconnect of they can condemn authoritarianism but still tolerate it. There's this Orwellian doublethink going on. I mean, and to add to your point, one of the problems is going to face us if we go down this route is also we lose any real moral high ground in condemning such things. I mean, how can we condemn Putin's treatment of his own people or other people, the Ukrainians or anything else, or China, how they treat their own people, or and the fact they have camps and everything like that. How can we say no to that with a straight face, yet we have him here at home, or maybe not to the same degree, but we're kind of on that path. It is very scary to see everyday Australians just being pro-authoritarian, and if you ask them, they will say, "Oh, I'm open-minded. I'm accepting of everyone. I love people."
They say that they'll probably say they're in the center of politics as well. They won't say that they have any particular persuasion towards, liberty or authority or left or right. The reality is, I think, as you said correctly, we've already lost that moral high ground over the past 2 years internationally. And you can see that right now in the rhetoric that's being used to condemn Putin by the mainstream media. If you go watch, turn on any conservative news outlet in the US at the moment, you'll see them condemning the attacks on civilian populations and the just unilateral invasion of a foreign sovereign nation. And there would be the argument that that means that Putin is automatically a war criminal and the like. And there's not even a hint of irony in their voice that everything they describe meets exactly what the US did in Iraq and Afghanistan and in other places. We don't have any irony about it now. And the only way that we will be able to maintain a semblance of moral high ground in the future is by being intellectually dishonest with ourselves as to what our own actions look like if we were to hold them into a mirror. And the reality is we are looking at the sort of early stages of foundational sort of authoritarianism in these Western countries, in the same sense that we can see them now in a full-fledged form in countries like China and in Russia. If you just give me a sec, I might just close my window because I think you might be getting a little bit of the rain in the background. Can you hear the rain, or is it okay?
Oh no,
that's okay. All good.
I don't know. Yeah.
So more to the point, I think in terms of domestic, one of the issues that I think I have been extremely worried about, and it goes to the point I was just making as well, is that I think mentioning Orwell, the last 2 years we have learned what it is to live in a one-party state, because there hasn't been a major political party that's been against the authoritarianism that's been propagated. Whether it's Labor or Liberal, we've heard the same message. And in some senses, you've heard Liberals say it if they're in government, and you've heard the opposition leader come out and say, yes, I support it because the chief health officer says, X, Y, Z, so therefore we support them. There hasn't been any true accountability. There hasn't been any true challenge. There hasn't really been any opposition in Australia for the past 2 years. They have lived in a political environment where they haven't been criticised by the media, they haven't been criticised by their opposition, and they've made, to the best of their ability, protest completely illegal.
Selectively, because I remember during the shutdown, the lockdowns, if the protest was about climate change, or if it was about Black Lives Matter, or if it was about that, then they still allowed it, but maybe, we recommend you don't do it, but it's okay, but we understand. But then when it came to if you're protesting the lockdown, then it was very heavy-handed, the police and the condemnation by the media and everything. So it's selective, which was strange considering it's supposed to be a pandemic. A disease doesn't really recognize why a group of people are next to each other. He's not going to back off recognizing it to be, it's about climate change, we won't affect anyone today. It's about lockdown, okay, we'll affect everybody. So
that's exactly right.
Very strange, the behavior. And
just in general, when it suits them, they would say it's extremely contagious and no one can do anything. But then the weather's looking pretty good and people in the eastern suburbs want to hit the beach. So the next thing they say is, well, you can't really get it outdoors. And all of these protests have been occurring outdoors. But the next week, whenever there's a protest, suddenly it's a super spreader event and these people are all jerks for going out and protesting. So, and that goes to the point I was making in relation to the one-party state. we didn't explicitly say this is a one-party state, but no one-party state really ever does. You know, if you go and look into Russia's political system, there's a number of other parties. You know, in all of these countries, you can find there are shell opposition parties that are sitting there. It's like that in Azerbaijan, which is another country I have some heritage from. You know, you can see the shell opposition is there, but they're there just for the sake of giving the system a democratic look. It's just there for the sake of aesthetics. There's not actually any opposition being expressed. And we got a taste of that in the last 2 years. We had politicians that are meant to be diametrically opposed have absolutely no beef for 2 years about how things are going. The only difference in approach that they had and that they would question each other on is, if Liberal was in power, Labor would say, well, I would be going harder. And strangely enough, down in Victoria, the gripe that the opposition leader had for a large period of time, the Liberal opposition leader had, was I would actually make the fines heavier than what Daniel Andrews' fines were. So, you know, we're in this vacuum where there was just this one-party state. What really is starting to grind me now at this stage, in the beginning of 2022, heading into an election, is we just had the Nationals down in Victoria declare that their stated position is that they're against mandates, lockdowns, mask restrictions, and vaccine requirements.
How convenient.
How convenient. They were a party. They were literally party to the entire period on the national and all the state levels. They're as part of the coalition. They were party to propagating the authoritarianism. Now, because they can see it's unpopular, especially down in Victoria, they're trying to jump on the bandwagon as being anti-authoritarian. You know, this is, as you mentioned before, Orwell, it's the kind of newspeak that we've had exposed to us, which is, you know, you can say something and mean something completely different. And you can have the kind of doublethink, which is that people who supposedly supported authoritarianism 6 months ago can now turn around and be freedom fighters. And, you know, you just can't build a political system that has any stability and any principles on that basis. It's building on quicksand.
Yeah, I know. But turning towards the election, how do you see the chances of the LDP in having a breakthrough moment? I mean, obviously, winning government is not a realistic expectation.
Yeah.
I would see it as more of a chance if they do get a significant amount on a, you know, Senate or state or local level, and gain enough of a presence to be, I suppose, the Socratic gadfly of Australian politics, of being the policeman, at least. I mean, the Australian Democrats back in the day had that role. They were the independent conscience of the Australian electorate. But since then, it's just been, since they collapsed, it's just been nothing. It's just been either a uniparty, an unofficial uniparty, or support or opposition for partisan reasons. But there hasn't really been a true independent presence there for a long time. Do you think the LDP has a chance of really gaining traction this election?
I think the LDP does have a very good chance of gaining more public awareness, in particular at this election. I wouldn't say that we're likely to pick up many seats, particularly in the lower house, because I'm noticing still quite a lot of people don't know about the party, because at the end of the day, we haven't had the money like Clive Palmer to go and pump text messages into everyone's phones. And at the end of the day, you know, coming from a small party background without that financial resource, the only other way that you can build awareness is by having volunteers and by building a base, both in the community and sort of in a larger online sense. And I think the party in the last year or two in particular has done quite well at increasing the number of members, increasing the number of volunteers, and getting its ground game for passionate members and candidates worked out. And there is a lot of work still needed to be done, of course. And in UAP's, sense, I mean, I'm obviously looking at it as well as someone who's standing for election. UAP has a whole lot of money, but not a lot of the systems in place within the party to effectively administer it as a party, even though they've got 150 candidates or whatever it is in the election coming up. The reality is they haven't, because of that, sudden rush of enthusiasm, they haven't had time to vet the candidates. They haven't had time to go through and actually, create game plans for each electorate. It's been very much just a rush, a blitzkrieg of political resources in their favor. Now, if they can manage the momentum, they can become, with their resources, a political force. There's no doubt. The Liberal Democrats probably in the long run have a similar capacity. Without those resources, we're going to need a much more grassroots approach. The way I see the next election playing out realistically is I think we can, in quite a number of seats, have a very good crack at the incumbent candidate. And I think that our preferences, if obviously people preference us first, our preference deals, if they're followed by the electors, can be extremely persuasive as well, and will make us, much more respected in terms of political force. Where I think we can gain actual traction is in the Senate. I think that there's enough energy on each state sort of level, in Queensland with Campbell Newman, New South Wales with John Ruddock, and then obviously in Victoria with David Limbrick and Crystal Mitchell, Carolyn White. Obviously not all three of those guys are going to get elected. It would be very unlikely anyway. The reality is I think there's enough energy in these three eastern states, and potentially in WA with our Senate candidate, Kate. There is potentially enough energy to get a couple of senators elected. And if we can do that, we may well have part of the balance of power in the Senate that allows us to actually push some of our moderating ideas onto the government of the day. In terms of our position, I think we actually have a better chance of cracking a few seats, both in the Legislative Council and the Legislative Assembly, at the March 2023 New South Wales election. I think that's where you'll start to see more grassroots candidates can get a better foothold because they're smaller electorates. You can canvass them a lot easier. And at the end of the day, the brunt of the frustration in relation to COVID and in relation to the economy around COVID has been created and is directed at state governments. So when there's a state election, you'll see people vent that frustration. So I think generally to your question, we have a good chance of getting some senators. We have a good chance of cracking a decent percentage in the lower house seats. I don't think we're going to get a sudden win or anything like that in the lower house. But at the same time, the building of our reputation, the building of our brand awareness allows us to have future elections more successfully challenged. And I think you'll see probably, if it continues on this trajectory, the 2023 state election in New South Wales will be a very, very different affair to the federal election this year. In terms of where we are positioned when we do finally make it, I don't think that the Liberal Democrats, given the principles that we have, would be able to become, for example, the major force like the Liberal Party is now. Because the only way the Liberal Party is able to do what it does now is, number one, by coalitioning with the Nationals, and number two, by being a big tent, which means that it's, you could be anywhere from, somewhat socialist, but, conservative in your cultural values on one end, to being a complete conservative economically and socially like John Howard on the other. And in that sense, that's why the Liberal Party, I think, is such an enticing beast historically, because you can put together these people who, on each end are diametrically opposed, but they're brought together because of the people in the middle who are willing to split the difference. That middle has shrunk sufficiently now, I think, that the party no longer really works. So when you do see the Liberals actually split and there's more splintering, I think that there will be a very similar coalition, but I think that coalition on, the centre right, or whatever the mainstream would say, I would say more on the Liberal side or the Libertarian side, as you mentioned. Those people will have different parties, but they will coalition. So I think the end goal you'll see for the Liberal Democrats is, in 20 years' time, or potentially a bit earlier, depending on how things evolve. The end goal is that we would be one part of a coalition of sort of those minor parties which make up a majority in Parliament. In terms of our immediate goal is, like I said, to get enough people elected to actually start blocking and start holding hostage some legislation in order to get effectively some concessions that the taxes will be lower or that the measures will be less invasive, effectively to put a bit of a blunted edge on the laws that are being passed or amended. So that's how I would characterize our party. I don't see, in my lifetime at least, and you can probably tell me because you have a very good understanding of history as well, I don't see in my lifetime a straight up and down libertarian party, small government, pro-freedom, and very, very much market economics based rather than Keynesian. I don't see a party like that becoming the major party on its own in this country. It's in terms of its principles, it is far too philosophical and far too disciplined in order for it to be a major party like that. You wouldn't be able to convince that number of people that, let's say 50% of the people, you'd never be able to convince 50% of people that all of those things in a libertarian worldview are correct. In the absence of being a big tent, I think our best option is to stay principled and refined and coalition with other parties around us that potentially have similar values. And obviously, working together, we moderate those positions a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree. Australia, I see Australian culture though being more maybe social democrat.
Yeah.
Broadly speaking, a pure libertarian party. I don't think that there's enough of our support there to become one of the major two parties.
No.
But however, we don't think you have to be, because you have to look at how you define success. A lot people would say, well, if you don't form government, then you're a loser. You haven't gained anything. But I would look at it this way. I use the example of Nigel Farage in Britain. He's a guy that him or his party never gained one seat in Parliament. However, he managed to win two national elections, the European elections, which were national level. He managed to put so much pressure on both the major party and the government to have a referendum on leaving the EU, which they never wanted to do. Not only that, he was on the winner side of the referendum. And not only that, when the government seemed to have gone off their path, he formed a Brexit party and held them to so much pressure that they got rid of Theresa May and replaced her with Johnson, which, relatively speaking, was more Eurosceptic, but I never was too sold on him either. But relatively speaking, he was more Eurosceptic and populist than any of the other Tory party members. And not only that, there's now still him having the influence of whenever he says something, people pay attention. Now you have to ask yourself, which career would you rather have? Get a seat in Parliament and sit there for decade after decade until you retire and no one knows who you are, or never win a seat yet have the success of Nigel Farage. Now,
Yeah,
officially speaking, he's a loser because he never won a seat. He never reformed the government. Never became prime minister. But look at the success.
yeah. Well, I think, and if I'm correct, and you probably be able to say better than I will because you have an international sort of relations background. A country like Israel has a number of minor parties that form its majority to make government. So they have a fairly strong sort of coalition approach. And I know the system is quite different, but Italy as well, so far as I'm aware, has a very, very strong sort of coalition approach. And I know your background's Italian, so I won't pretend that I know quite as much. But I know, I think the mentality that, well, if you don't win the election outright on your own, you're a loser. I think that mentality is propagated by the people who are currently in the major two parties, and by the media that likes to very neatly package the elections and package the electoral system, so that essentially it reduces the level of complexity they have to deal with, because complexity means a certain amount of uncertainty. And the media only like uncertainty when they get to control the narrative around it. In relation to this COVID thing, it's another perfect example. You could say there's a new variant every 6 months, that the COVID virus was in control of government policy, and the COVID virus was in control of how we responded and how society evolved. But you wouldn't be observing the fact that every day at the press conferences that were being held, the Premier would come and say one thing and be very restrained, but the questions that she was being asked, Berejiklian was being asked, was, why haven't you gone harder? Why haven't you gone harder? Why haven't you gone harder? And you can see that whenever she did go harder, she got more and more praise from the media. It's a kind of controlled chaos. They have been feeding it, and they have been very tactically measuring it so that they can control the level of uncertainty that they're dealing with. Whenever a new variant arises, they've been happy with that because at the end of the day, they have been preparing for that uncertainty months in advance. Whereas something like this in Ukraine, you can see that they're scrambling and they're not really sure what quite to say, because the reality is they're not sure whether they should be pumping the pro-war or the pro-peace line right now. They're not sure whether, whether the Ukrainians are in control of X, Y, or Z anymore. The lines have been blurred, and that uncertainty has made the media in relation to this issue extremely cautious and extremely, it's made them extremely conservative in how they're approaching things, almost like they would approach them if they were trying to be more neutral, back in the old days when the media tried to actually report the news rather than make it. But with that said, the political system is no different. The political system is, it's victim number one in many ways. It was the first thing that they managed to get their arms around completely. The idea that minor parties will come and they can break that hold in order to introduce a new kind of uncertainty into the system is something which is adverse to the media's interests completely, as well as the major parties. But in my view, as I mentioned, the measure of success is not only that you are obviously making headway in terms of your overall objective like Farage did, but also the measure of success is that the country continues to maintain its stable traditions and continues to maintain its Western values and its characteristics that have made it successful, right? So I think the idea that the party needs to win outright, as is propagated, is not only wrong. I think the approach that we should be championing is, well, it's better to have more diversity in whoever does form government, because you're more likely to get greater accountability. If instead of the coalition being made up of two parties, it was made up of 4 or 5, it would mean that the Prime Minister has a party room that's much smaller in his own sort of party, And it would mean that he has to consult more people from different political perspectives and objectives in order to get his policy agenda across the line, which in the worldview of someone who's, for example, a radical authoritarian is terrible, because it means that you've got to negotiate and settle things with more people before you can get your policy across the line. And when you do get it across the line, it's going to be watered down. It's not going to be what you want. But the reality is, I think that approach, that moderated approach, is much, much more effective at maintaining not only freedoms, but a stable democracy as well. The one or two party sort of approach really does hurt the body politic in the long run, particularly when there's an emergency at play. And, in the last 2 years, I think that the major parties have done that disservice to themselves, in the sense that they really did eat the forbidden fruit. They gave into their tendencies towards control and towards, just doing whatever they want rather than consulting people. And, the curse that's going to now be put on them by the people is there will be much greater skepticism, not only to them, but to the bureaucrats and to the, so-called experts that they are consulting to justify their measures. I've been saying all the way through, the next time Dr. Kerry Chant is on our TV screen, screaming and chanting about, the next virus, and the next virus could genuinely be an Ebola outbreak in Western Sydney, there's going to be a large number of people that are just going to not listen, because they had to deal with her every single day, talking about subjects which she obviously didn't have the answers to. Just because someone is an expert in a particular field does not mean they are the font of all knowledge and that they can answer every question. If she doesn't know the answer, she shouldn't have been pretending she does and giving people inaccurate information effectively. They didn't know whether masks were effective or not. They pinned them to every single person's face for months. I mean, in WA, they're still pinning them to people's faces. The studies are now being done, randomized control studies are being done now, that show that the cloth masks in particular are as good as not wearing a mask at all. The only mask that they can find some anecdotal evidence for working is N95 masks. And those masks are extremely expensive and still have to be changed regularly. So the reality is, if every day the chief health officer is getting on TV and screaming alongside the politicians that you must wear a mask, and 6 months later it's found that it was completely useless exercise, it had no bearing, the trust and confidence that people have, not in the politicians, because everyone knows what they are, but in the experts that have been university educated, that have been years of training, those people lose their credentials as well in the eyes of the public. And it gets to a stage where there's a group of the society, there's a subsection of the society that just will not listen to whatever anyone in government says. It just will go in one ear and out the other. And in some cases, so let's say it was an Ebola outbreak, in some cases that will actually cause more deaths. It will cause more deaths in itself than needed to occur, because they shot their own confidence straight to the moon. They put it outside of anyone's orbit. No one's listening to them. So when something real comes along, the girl that cried, or the boy that cried wolf style, no one's going to actually listen. So a number of things there, I think, that are coming up. And as I say, it can all be fixed if we just start having a better dialogue politically, in a public sense, a better dialogue where people are being represented and their views are not being shot down just because they, go against the mainstream narrative. There needed to be more challenge in the last 2 years. It didn't happen, fine. But now we're coming out of this period. We need that challenge to be there going forward.
Having said that, just to piggyback on what you were saying, I think there's a lot of anger and distrust now, but I think this was an accumulation effect. this has been coming for a very long time. I would go back to this, to this love of this technocracy, these philosopher kings, that everybody should just shut their own mind off and just listen to. I think they've been discredited for a long time now. I would go all the way back to 9/11. I mean, I would go back. Actually, not only that, I would go back to the fall of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell, there were experts there who, okay, the Soviet Union is going a bad period, but they're not going to be gone. They're not going to be. Pretty soon after, you have to rewrite the maps. Gone completely. The Soviet Union, no more. But there was that. There was the 9/11. Experts didn't see the 9/11 happen. Just didn't happen. Just happened one day. Everyone was caught unsurprised or surprised. Plus, the experts of how we should conduct the war, and then it went from getting the terrorists to going against Saddam, and then going against Libya and everything else, and bring democracy to the rest of the world. Those experts were, they argued at the beginning, oh, it's going to be a cakewalk walking through Afghanistan. It'll be fine. We got superior military, and when we get there, we're going to be liberators, and people are going to love us. Completely wrong. The '08 financial crisis, didn't see it happening. I mean, there was getting rid of Glass-Steagall, getting rid of every other restriction you can think of, and eventually everything collapsed. But they didn't see that coming either. The referendum of Brexit, didn't see it coming. Of course, everyone's going to vote to stay. Don't be stupid. Trump getting elected, never going to happen. I mean, no way. It's going to be a landslide victory. They were saying that on the day of the election, landslide victory for Hillary, to the point where they had the special edition magazine printed off, Madame President, all ready to be shipped and go. So much so they didn't even make one for Trump, just in case he won. It just wasn't printed. They just, no way he's gonna win. He won. So then, of course, then it was the then it was the COVID thing recently. So this track record of these experts, I'm not saying that there's not a place for them, or they're not educated, or you should completely dismiss out of hand of what they have to say. But that's all they should do. They should just advise, and then you're supposed to take in the information and think for yourself. But there seems to be a chunk of the population that want the experts to think for them.
Yeah.
That want to be told what to think.
Yeah. I mean, well, you're 100% right. And in relation to COVID, I don't have anything, in terms of expertise. I wouldn't go so far as ever to say that these people are not qualified at whatever they're doing. But, for an expert to be an expert, they have to be working with the materials that make them an expert. For me, it's these, things behind me. I'm a lawyer. I work with books, right? And I read the judgments. I read the philosophy around the law, and then that's how I'm able to apply my craft. I'm able to apply my expertise. If you're a public health doctor, or you're a public health scientist, or a public health economist, what you are looking at is the raw data that is coming from these events or coming from studies. You're looking at the studies themselves. You're looking at the lab studies. You're looking at the randomized control studies. You're looking at whatever material you can find in terms of data, in order to actually make a rationalization from that to prescribe a particular path for people. Okay, and you would prescribe it. It's not something it's mandatory. It's just offered, right? That was the other problem, is obviously the experts became kings rather than experts. But right at the beginning of the pandemic, We had a number of experts, not like Dr. Chant, who was, a public health bureaucrat. We had a number of experts who were working at Stanford, working at Oxford, working at Harvard, that were looking at the raw data that was coming from China, and were doing their own studies as well. So we had the Santa Clara County. We had the, they say it was a seroprevalence study, and the seroprevalence study was to find how many people had traces of COVID essentially in their system. And this was very early on in the pandemic. And the findings came out that if you looked at it, my recollection is something like, for every one person that was a confirmed case of COVID, you had 50 that were unconfirmed, that were asymptomatic or whatever in the community, or it had very minor symptoms and then gotten over it, dismissed it as a cold, or some sort of sinus issue or something like that. If you crunch the numbers on that, and they did right at the beginning, with that sort of seroprevalence, compared to the case fatality rates, the infection fatality rates in society generally was much lower than 1%, which means that the vast majority of people are interacting with the alpha variant at that point, not getting sick, and definitely not dying of the virus. They were obviously getting it, they were transmitting it naturally, as we do with any virus that's as transmissible as COVID or the flu. But ultimately, they were not in vast majority of cases even getting sick, let alone getting sick and dying. That data was there from the very beginning, basically from the very beginning. Sometime around April, that data came out of 2020. That data was never reported to the Australian public. The Australian public never heard Dr. Chant come out and say there's been this fantastic study in America, and it's been confirmed by studies after, that has shown that the infection fatality rate of this virus is way less than 1%. Everyone stop panicking. We never had that moment. What we had was an increased, this is how many people got sick today that we can confirm. This is how many people have died. This sort of reporting of the worst case scenarios, not putting it into any context with the greater scientific understanding. And at the same time, offering prescriptions that were mandatory by force of law for a whole category of, mitigatory, or, in some cases, they said it would completely prevent the virus. All of these measures were offered up with basically no scientific evidence. People can go and look at Dr. Vinay Prasad, who's been writing articles on this subject, and he was pro-restrictions in the beginning. He was very heavily pro-vaccine, not necessarily mandate, but pro-vaccine. And he was saying back then that it was proportionate to have mask mandates and all those other things. He's a man of the left in terms of sort of the mainstream's political persuasions. He doesn't have any problem with particular controls being imposed if they're proportionate. He's been writing articles for the last at least 3 to 4 months, coming around and saying, well, look, there was no evidence, and there never has been any evidence that cloth masks do anything. There's never been any evidence that vaccines for kids under the age of 12 are necessary. There's never been any evidence that masking kids in school is a good idea. So all of these sort of, understandings are there. We've known what we have. We've had certain studies that say it's less deadly than the cases would show. And we've also had a whole bunch of data that's missing, that the experts have had to decide whether or not they're going to give an opinion on the missing data that's going to be draconian or it's going to be recommended. They had no data to support the idea that masks would be a fantastic idea to mitigate things. They made it mandatory rather than recommended. And when you stack up all of those aspects, just like you said with the Brexit sort of vote, the experts had no idea. Trump, they had no idea. With 9/11, with all of these other events, the 2008 financial crisis, the problem we're facing here is a problem of information. These experts are being looked to as authority, absolute authority for a proposition. In COVID, it was the proposition that authoritarianism is the safest way to go. They came out and they gave that opinion because that's what the media, and that's what the politicians wanted them to give. Just like, in all of the other crises, that's what they were there to do. In our case, it's turned around and bit them once again because they simply didn't have the information needed to make a call at all, let alone to make the call that they did.
So sorry to interrupt, but this reminds me, it wasn't just the lack of information; it was the selective information. Because they seem to be hell bent on wanting to follow a Chinese-inspired authoritarian response. However, you had Sweden this whole time, which was doing no mandates, no masks, no anything like that, and no one even looked at them. I remember even talking, this anecdotal, but even everyday people, I would mention Sweden, and they would scoff. They were, ugh, like don't bring that up or whatever. They didn't want to know, and that was the everyday person on the street. But they were also simply on the expert political technocratic level. They didn't want nothing that they set it seemed they set a narrative, an agenda, and that was it. And it was as authoritarian as you can get. Because for me, I would look at the different models available, and how come Sweden was not only ignored but condemned. On top of that, it's hard to get my head around because it goes so completely against the science, follow the science.
Yeah.
Well, what about them? Well, why not look there? Well, they're obviously doing something. Let's look at them.
Not only that, I mean, just in general, I mean, that principle that they tout is like, believe the science or follow the science. It's like the science is not a religion that has a doctrine that you're meant to follow blindly. Science is a process by which we find conclusions. The process is an empirical assessment of things through testing and through measurement, right? And the idea that we've been following the science when there hasn't been any testing or any data is antithetical to even the concept of science. You can say we have a theory that masks is a great way to mitigate this, but we don't have any data. We're just playing with it. And we'll see. Worst case scenario, you wore a mask and it didn't have too much of a negative consequence on you. If you sold it to me like that, at least I'd say you're honest. But when people have been told this is something that will prevent you from dying and it will prevent you and the person with you from getting or catching COVID, spreading or catching COVID, I should say. The reality is, without any data to support that proposition, when I question it, when you tell me I am the one who's being unscientific, that rubs not only me, but it rubs most people the wrong way who've got any kind of brain. Because the reality is, you are claiming now to speak for something which isn't meant to be spoken for. It's meant to speak for itself. The data will speak for itself. The data that came out of China during the first wave of this virus, and I'm always cynical with data that comes from China, but I sort of will look at some of the players in this and what they've said. Dr. Martin Kulldorff from Harvard is a health statistician, right? He said right at the very beginning of the pandemic that this isn't something that we need to be absolutely in shock about, because the case fatality numbers that were coming out of China revealed that this virus is extremely problematic for the elderly, people above the age of 75. But for anyone under the age of 75, particularly under the age of 65, this virus does not pose a significant risk. And we knew that because you could extrapolate that the majority of Wuhan would have come into contact with the virus. So you had a large number of people in contact of all different age groups, but disproportionately the virus was killing the elderly. So you knew very early on, you could extrapolate from that very early on, and he did, that we needed focused protection of the elderly from the very outset. We took that data, public health officials took that data, threw it in the bin, and in New York, which did the worst out of any place in the world, whenever the hospitals were overflowing, where did they take all the COVID patients? Straight to the nursing homes. It's got to be, it's ludicrous, the idea. And to think that the same people who took sick COVID patients and put them into nursing homes should be trusted to rule in an authoritarian fashion over all of us and determine what's best for all of our health is a nonsense. It's just an absurdity. They got it wrong right at the beginning, and they've got it wrong all the way through. It didn't get any better. And right now, the only reason that they're suddenly starting to get it right is because at the end of the day, it's simply not economically possible to keep getting it wrong. If they continue on this trajectory, if they continue doing what they wanted to do with their zero COVID nonsense all the way until the end of 2021, the reality is our economy and our culture, our social structures were primed for explosion. They were primed for destruction. There was no way we were going to be able to keep limping into the future, into 2022, with any small businesses left, let alone many jobs. So, I like to tell people now, because everything's starting to open up. It's opening up because it has to, not because the government suddenly is getting it right or suddenly agrees that we have particular rights or we have particular freedoms. They're doing it because if they don't do it, things are going to self-destruct effectively. And those experts who have been made, essentially into gods the last 2 years, are now going to limp out of the picture, get back behind their desk at their particular government department with a huge pay increase, and be heard from basically never again, because they've served their purpose. They've served the purpose, which was to justify 2 years of abject tyranny. And the purpose in the long run is to set the precedent that if we want, we can bring this in. We can do this if we need to.
And not even due to a pandemic. It could be for any other reason too.
Oh yeah,
But the infrastructure has now been established, and the public has got used to the idea that it's okay.
Well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, the idea now of checkpoints, which was, this ridiculous, how dare you even contemplated idea 3 years ago, 4 years ago. The reality is the idea of checkpoints in the Western world was ridiculous. There's no way you could have internal checkpoints. We have borders, and then once you're in the border, have at it. Not anymore. Now you can be locked into your own city, and they can set up checkpoints on every suburb, on every city. There can be a checkpoint on your way out and on your way in. Where are you going? Show me your papers. That is something which is unprecedented in our country, and it's something which now, because it has become a precedent, if it isn't addressed quickly and squashed, will be repeated again in the future. And I think that's why I am not only with the Liberal Democrats promoting a more free country, but also I'm promoting the idea that these parties need to be broken up. They need to break up. People need to find their intellectual comrades. They need to find the place in the political system in principle that works best for them. Put all of the politics aside in terms of what their, for example, best chance of getting elected is at the moment. Look to the future, for the future of our children. Find the group that most suits you. Build that support. Build support for that group in the community, and form more coalition governments so that you're going to get less direct authoritarianism in the country. Make it harder for this kind of power to ever be exercised again politically.
Well, we've definitely gone over time, but if you want to say any last comments about what's on your mind, or where we should look towards, or any ideas?
Well, all I can say to people, I think ultimately, is if you're going to make a difference this year, if you're going to start moving forward, and I'm not going to do the usual spiel of vote for me. I am running in the McMahon electorate at the next election, but I'm not going to spruik myself in that way. I'm not a self-promotion type. What I will tell people is, if they can, not only support their small businesses that have done it tough the last 2 years, If there are any startups in their community, go and help them out, particularly if they're in Western Sydney. And most importantly, if you are looking to make a difference after this terrible period of authoritarianism, if you're looking to make a difference, support smaller government generally, regardless of who's putting it forward, and ultimately be the change that you want to see by whenever you have a problem or whenever you see an issue, take direct action, go and actually put your money where your mouth is, spend some time fixing that problem in your community. Don't just resort straight to the government. Don't resort to coercion. Find a resolution for the issues on your own efforts. Because if we become more community-based, if we become more voluntarily sort of cooperative with each other, we have a much better chance of building a better future down the track. Ultimately, the resort to, well, I'm just going to get this person in government to do it. That person in government's only going to be able to get their policy across by taking something from someone else and giving it to the person that you are interested in helping. What's much, much more ethical and much better is you taking action on it yourself and helping people out more directly. Be a better community member. And, I think, we didn't touch on it this episode, or we didn't touch on it, here today, but, having good family values and reinvigorating those good family values is important too. Because in times like this, where we've been separated and segregated, not allowed to see people, not only being a good community member, but being a good family member, being supportive of those around you is infinitely important. So change starts at the dinner table, change starts in your neighborhood. Go out there and actually seek to make that change happen, and ultimately support causes that will be in favor of more freedom in the future.
Okay, and finally, is there any places or social platforms people can reach you?
Certainly, I'm on Twitter. So my handle on Twitter, from memory, it's pretty new, is C Shamsabad. At obviously the Twitter, yeah, so C Shamsabad. You can also find me on Facebook. I have a candidates page. So just type in Kamran Shamsabad, LDP candidate for McMahon. Alternatively, I run a constitutional law podcast. So I actually teach people constitutional law. It's completely free. I haven't made a single cent on it. That's my way of contributing intellectually to the community in helping educate people. The podcast is called Surviving Constitutional Law, and I go through in depth each topic of constitutional law and try and give everyone an overview, not only of the Constitution's text, but also the main court decisions that have taken place in that space. So it's a pretty useful little platform. Alternatively, and obviously I'm trying my best to keep it separate, but if you have a legal issue, you can always find me. I'm a solicitor at Banga Legal, BANGA Legal. And if you send us an inquiry and just say you'd like to speak to Kamran, I'll be able to get back to you on that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me tonight, and best of luck, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Thank you, Daniel.